Good evening and welcome to this evening's event hosted by the British Academy of Forensic Sciences and our President Tracy Alexander. Professor Atholl Johnston will be presenting on alcohol, drugs and driving, section 5A, 6 years on. And you'll be able to post questions for Professor Johnston to answer into the Q&A or the chat. And we'll have a Q&A discussion at the end of his talk. Just to let everyone know that we're going to be recording this event and it will be made available from our website at BAFS. I hope you enjoy the evening. I'm going to hand you over now to our President, Tracy Alexander.
Good evening. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining us. I'm bringing this event to you from what was the Church of St Mary Aldermanbury. There's been a church on this site since 1181, but like so many things in this area, it was burnt down in the fire of 1666 to be rebuilt and then bombed in 1940. The remains of that church are now somewhere in Arizona, part of a memorial to Winston Churchill. It's all the back garden of that police station, which is Wood Street, and I'm locked out of it. So hopefully by the end of what I'm sure is going to be a marvellous evening, I'll be inside, because it's not as warm as you might think out here. So it's just remaining for me to say thank you so much, Atholl, for giving up your time to talk to us this evening. He's been my go-to guy for toxicology for such a long time, so we're in for a bit of a treat. So I'm going to hand over to Atholl, and hopefully I will see you guys for the question and answer session from the inside very, very soon. Atholl, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy. I'm not sure whether I'm the go-to guy for toxicology or not, but let's see if I'm the go-to guy for getting this screen share running and see that I've got the right thing. So let's try that one, share that, and start the show. Oh, wake up. Oh God, doing this again, sorry. We got this right, but we did actually rehearse all this. We seem to have messed it up again. Right, 1 second. Get back. Why we bother, because it just doesn't seem to work the way it was supposed to. Right. Back to shut this thing up last time. I did. Right. Have we got just one slide on the picture now? Can someone tell me?
Yes, we have, Atholl, that's fine.
Right. Sorry, it seems to default into presentation mode. Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to talk tonight on alcohol, drugs, driving, section 5A, 6 years on. So the presentation content, I'm going to talk about legislation in general for impaired driving, and particularly about determining impairment, because that's one of the issues that why 5A was brought in, to make it easier to convict people who are driving while taking drugs. I'm going to talk a little bit about reducing the specified alcohol limit that they've done in Scotland. And then I'm going to go into drug driving section A, talk about the first year after enactment, a report that was done by Research Solutions. And then I'm going to give you the results of the first 2,500 motorists that we've looked at ASI, their blood, and talk a little bit about specified limits and talk about the impact on the courts. So impaired driving legislation actually is earlier than we had cars. First mention of it was probably 1872 with the Licensing Act, when being and drunk and charged of carriages, horses, cattle, and steam engines became an offence. We didn't actually get cars till 1885, I think, with the opening of the Daimler factory in Coventry, and the first fatal road traffic collision or accident, whatever you want to call it, was 1899 when the back wheel of one of those Daimlers came off on Harrow Hill and the contents of the car were pitched out and the two men died. But going on from carriages, horses, cattle and steam engines, 1925 we had the Criminal Justice Act, and it became an offence to be found in drunk and charge of any mechanically propelled vehicle on any highway or public place. Now, of course, the problem is drunk. What is drunk? How can you tell someone is drunk? You know what it is when you see it, as they say, but that doesn't necessarily stand up in court, because it's your word as a motorist against the policeman who's giving evidence, or whoever's giving evidence against you. So that's not all that satisfactory. And then along came the Road Traffic Act in 1930, and again, to drive, attempt to drive, or be in charge of a motor vehicle on a road or any other public place while being under the influence of drink or a drug to such an extent as incapable of having proper control of the vehicle was there. In 1960, we got to drive, attempt to drive, or be in charge of a motor vehicle on a road or public place where unfit to drive through drink and drugs. So drugs was added in 1960. But again, under the influence of drink or a drug to such an extent as to be incapable of having proper control of the vehicle. What does that mean? Under the influence of drink or drug, or unfit to drive through drink or drugs? How do we work out whether someone's unfit to drive or under the influence of drink or drugs, and how that's affecting their driving? So, this is the issue: to drive, attempt to drive, while the ability of being impaired. So that led to 1967, the Road Safety Act, a legal limit for alcohol, blood and urine, and there was a failure to provide offence. You couldn't just say, I'm not giving you a blood sample or a urine sample. And then we got the breathalyzer. And the breathalyzer wasn't actually type approved, although the legislation was there in 67, the breathalyzer wasn't type approved until 1968. What does type approved means? Well, it means that the Home Office looked at it and saw that worked out that the breathalyzer was fit for purpose and effectively licensed a number of breathalyzers for use in road transport. 1981, the Transport Act introduced evidential breath testing. So you would fail at the roadside. In 1967, you'd fail at the roadside, or 1968, you'd fail at the roadside, then you had to have a blood sample or a urine sample. 1981 introduced the idea that you failed at the roadside, but then you could go to the police station and have an evidential breath testing done and the concentration measured accurately. But again, that wasn't actually introduced until 1983, when there was type approval for, I think, the Lion Intoximeter 3000, I think it was. So again, that showed that it was accurate and precise and could be used for the purpose. Then 2005, the Road Traffic Act 1988 was amended to allow roadside evidential testing, but as yet no type approval has been given to devices that might be able to do that with sufficient accuracy to convict motorists of driving while having too much alcohol in their system. What's going on now? Not being able to measure drugs didn't actually stop, or so not being able to have a limit for drugs didn't stop you being prosecuted, because in the Road Traffic Act 1988, there was Section 4, that was driving or being in charge when under the influence of drink or drugs. And if you were under the influence of a drug, you had to be shown to be unfit again and to be impaired at that stage. And usually drug evidence was used to support that. But there wasn't a specific limit for drugs. You had to go and argue this out in court. And certainly I've been in court several times arguing whether a particular concentration is impairing or not. So unfit to drive through drink and drugs and being impaired. So again, you're back down to this business of the police having to show someone's impaired before they can be taken to court. And so how do you prove the driving's been impaired? How do you demonstrate impairment? Well, this has been studied long ago. This is a publication from Eric Widmark. You may know Eric Widmark from the fact that the Widmark factor is used in alcohol technical defense and also other forensic applications of alcohol, where Eric Widmark did a lot of the pioneering work on the pharmacokinetics of alcohol, how alcohol's eliminated from the body and how it's distributed in the body. And as part of that study, he looked at 162 individuals whose range of blood alcohol concentrations ranged between 0 and 340 milligrams per deciliter. Remember, the limit in England and Wales is 80 milligrams per deciliter for specified limit for driving. So he got 7 doctors to assess these people for 8 signs of alcohol use and to give their opinion. And he looked at things like smell of alcohol in the breath, whether they actually would have been diagnosed as influenced by the doctors, and various other things. Consider it a Romberg test, which is something we still use today. Movement, forward direction, stammering speech, all of those things. And looking at alcohol concentration between 160 and twice the legal limit and 180, 84% of people had alcohol in their breath. 79% were diagnosed by these 7 doctors as influenced, right down to 25% would have been diagnosed, at least it would have been considered impaired just by stammering speech alone. So let me show you this in a different way. Here's alcohol odor on the breath. So on the left-hand side, we've got percentage of individuals, and on the bottom, on the x-axis, we've got alcohol concentration in blood, milligrams per deciliter. And what I'm showing you is a cumulative graph of cumulative frequency graph. So as you go to the right, the frequency increases until you get to 100%. So if we take 80 milligrams per deciliter, that's here, we're looking at about 50% of people who are 80 milligrams per deciliter, they would have 50% of them would have alcohol smell on their breath. And so it goes on until you get to about 280 when everyone smells of alcohol. What about diagnosed as influenced? Again, we're going along here and you can see it rises and at 80, only about 18% of people would be considered to be under the influence by these 7 Swedish doctors. And actually, you need to get to about 140 before half of them would be considered to be under the influence. What about the Romberg test? For those of you who don't know what a Romberg test is, this is used today, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, in the preliminary and best impairment test or field impairment test, where you close your eyes, you tilt your head back a little, keep your arms by your side, and you count to 30. And you tell the nice policeman when you reach 30, and he or she looks at you and they decide whether you're swaying from side to side, for example, and how inaccurate you are in working out the 30 seconds. And you can see again that increases. Then we've got walking in a straight line. Clearly, most people can walk really up to quite high alcohol levels. And we use these preliminary impairment tests today. And the police use these 5 things. Pupil size, they look at your pupils, see that's influenced by drugs. Some drugs constrict the pupils, some drugs dilate the pupils. Romberg test, I've already said. Walk and turn, that's walking down a line, heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe, and you take 9 steps down that. Then at the end of the line, you turn around and do the same thing the other way. Can you stand on one leg without falling over or swaying dramatically? And can you take your finger from your waist and touch the tip of your nose without poking your eye out or something else? And these are all very straightforward tests. You need to be trained to administer them, but they're not difficult to do. And there is a pro forma which needs to be filled in. The problem with them is there is no pass or fail, and there's not even a way of scoring these tests that's uniform, and that makes it quite difficult to interpret them sometimes. Sometimes it's obvious like this individual here. We're just about to do a walk along the line test here, and there's the policeman on the left, and the gentleman is about to do it. Going to set the line out. So I don't think there's any doubt that that gentleman wasn't fit to be driving, but you know, some people have difficulty walking straight line. I once tried to demonstrate this to a class of students when I was wearing a pair of shoes that had sort of curved soles. I couldn't do it at all. I was all over the place, and I hadn't had a drop to drink. So footwear, where you are, what time of day it is. I've got another picture of this where there's a gale blowing and this poor girl's trying to walk down this line against quite a hard wind. So it's not great. So this is the issue. We're trying to link drugs to impairment, or linking drug to impairment. And of course, that link between the preliminary investigation tests or impairment tests and to driving, what is that? What is the link between my ability to stand on one leg and drive a car? It's very difficult to make a case for that. So maybe there isn't a link. And here's another example. This was a study done by the Transport Research Laboratory, and they looked at 15 subjects. They gave them a placebo, in other words, no drug, and they gave them a medium dose, a high dose, and a custom and excise cannabis resin dose, don't ask me what that is, of cannabis. So 3 doses of cannabis compared to no dose of cannabis. And they did driving assessment tests, they did psychomotor tests, and they did the preliminary investigation tests on these people. And they got trained individuals to do it. So this was the conclusion of the Transport Laboratories Cannabis and Driving study. I think they had expected to find that cannabis would be very detrimental to your driving. But what they had to conclude was the results of the driving-related laboratory tests conducted in general did not produce statistically significant results. So even with a high dose of cannabis, they couldn't show a statistical difference. There were a combination of impairment test failures which would allow a conclusion that a driver was impaired. In other words, the preliminary investigation test picked up people, but these people didn't have impaired driving. And I'm afraid the Transport Research Laboratory had to conclude it cannot be concluded that driving under the influence of cannabis is not a hazard. In other words, they were unable to show that driving with cannabis was a problem, but they couldn't admit that. And the Home Office, no doubt, spent quite a bit of money on this study. So little measurable effect on driving, and yet the subjects declared unfit or impaired on 11 occasions out of 56 using the preliminary investigation tests. And here's a much bigger study now. This is a study done by John Oliver in Scotland, where they looked at roughly 1,000 drivers who they'd screened for drugs. And when they did this, you look on the right-hand column, you can see the accuracy of the fit overall was only 66%. And depending on which test you looked at, the one-leg stand, interestingly, was quite good, and the walk and turn was quite good, but overall, the accuracy was very poor. Anyway, there was a report or review of the drug driving laws by Sir Peter North in 2010. And when he reviewed drink driving, he made 28 recommendations. And recommendation 3 was to reduce the drink drive limit to 50 milligrams per deciliter, to bring it down from 80 to 50. And round about the same time, a couple of slides ahead of myself, and there's good reason for thinking that. This is the number of people, the percentage of deaths, road traffic accidents, road traffic collisions end up in death. And you can see these are the people who were drink driving, and looking at that, you can see that between 2007 and 2017, we were still killing about 250 people a year on the road, and that could be linked to drink driving. In other words, people with over 80 milligrams %. And the reasoning goes, or went, if we could reduce that limit, we'd reduce the number of people. So if we can take the limit down to 50, we should get less people killed on the road. And round about that time, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, NICE usually pronounce on therapeutic benefit of drugs and therapeutic interventions, and they saw reducing the drug driving limit from 80 to 50 as a therapeutic intervention. And they gave a study on this and concluded that yes, it probably would save lives if it was done. So what's the issue here? Well, on the left-hand side, we've got relative crash risk. So one is no crash risk, so that's if you have no alcohol, and blood alcohol's on the x-axis. And as we go along, increasing the amount of alcohol in your blood, the amount of relative risk of having a crash increases. And you can see by the time you get to 25 milligrams per deciliter, you're talking about 180 times the relative risk of having an accident than if you have no alcohol in your system at all. But if you look at the lower end, we look at the relative risk at 50 milligrams per deciliter, it's you're 1.4 times more at risk at 50 than you are at 1. And at 80, you're 2.7 times more at risk of having a crash than you are at 0. So you could say, and can say quite clearly, that going from 80 to 50 would have your relative risk of having an accident. But we're talking relative risk here. We're not talking absolute risk. The relative risk of you actually, absolute risk of you actually having an accident on any given day is very, very low. And frankly, twice nothing is nothing. So the relative risk going from 2.7 to 1.4 probably makes very little difference at all. The other thing is I haven't shown you the confidence intervals on these values, which are quite wide. So there's actually probably a bit of an overlap between those two. So reduce the limit from 50 milligrams, reduce the limit to 50 milligrams per deciliter. The Scots have done it. So what's the impact? You know, they've already done it. They've had that in since the end of 2014. So here's the number of deaths in England, Wales, and Scotland from 210 to 216. And you can see in Scotland, about 20 people a year die on the roads from drink drivers. 2015, 1 year after the introduction of this, it was introduced on 5th of December 2014, 20 people died on the road. In fact, 2016, 30 people died on the road. So if anything, it went up. Now, it's just trivial to look at it that way. And other people have done a bit more statistically. And there's this publication by Jim Lucy, who looked at the impact of legislation to reduce the drink drive limit in road traffic accidents and alcohol consumption in Scotland. And he called it a natural experimental study, because they could actually look at what happened. Health economist Benjamin Cooper also looked at it, drink, death and driving. Do blood alcohol contents limit reductions improve road safety? What did they conclude? Well, Lucy said, we find the lowering of the blood alcohol concentration limit from 80 to 50 in Scotland did not decrease the rate of road traffic accidents in the first 2 years after a legislation change. Cooper, we find little evidence that the reduction in BAC limit led to a drop in either road traffic accidents or fatality rates. In other words, it made no difference to road traffic accidents. I'm sure it made quite a difference to the police and the general public and the infringement of the general public's liberty to drink. So that's enough of drink driving for a moment. Let's look on drug driving. Peter North made 23 recommendations on drug driving. Recommendation 12 and 13 were to introduce limits for drugs that were equivalent to the alcohol impairment limit. So he was suggesting there should be limits of drugs that was linked to the alcohol impairment limit. So introduce a limit that was considered for a drug that was comparable to the 18 milligrams per deciliter. He also made a recommendation 15, that the government should consider whether a zero tolerance offence was appropriate. So, who's this man? This is the man who really kicked it off in terms of got this started, because this was Mr. Page. Mr. Page was convicted of careless driving, in which he killed a schoolgirl called Lillian Groves. Lillian Groves was playing in her front garden on 26th of June 2010, and she knocked the ball into the road. She ran into the road to collect it, and Mr. Page ran her over and killed her. Mr. Page had been exceeding the speed limit. He'd been smoking cannabis. He was found guilty of causing death by careless driving. He could have been charged with a more serious offence of driving while under the influence of drugs, but there wasn't any way at that stage how you could do that easily, because they couldn't demonstrate impairment. Because after the event, quite rightly, he was quite shaken up. Poor old Lillian Groves was dead, but Mr. Page couldn't actually demonstrate impairment at that stage. So Lillian Groves' parents began a campaign to change the law, to try and get something done about drug driving. And they appealed to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, and in response, he supported the change. And in May 2012, he said, "We want to do for drug driving what drink driving laws have done for driving under the influence of alcohol. This week, we'll publish a new drug driving offence so that driving under the influence of drugs is a crime, just like it is for drink driving." And in April 2012, the Department for Transport set up an advisory working group to advise on impairing levels of certain drugs in the context of a possible future specific offence of driving whilst under the influence of drug in excess of prescribed concentration. So they got together 9 experts, of which I was one, to look at the influence of alcohol and drugs on road safety, together with Department for Transport and Home Office civil servants. And this was under the able chairmanship of Kim Wolfe, and we published this report, Driving Under the Influence of Drugs, and that was published in March 2013. And that led to the Section 5A offence of driving or being charged for a motor vehicle with a concentration of specified controlled drug above a specified level. That was introduced in March 2015. And it was introduced actually in October 2014, but only came into force in March. And it was brought in using a statutory instrument, an amendment of the 1988 Road Traffic Act. And it was a strict liability offence. It specified limits for 17 drugs in whole blood. It classed them in 2 different classes, 9 where there were recognised medicinal uses, and 8 which were used recreationally, for want of a better word, where there was no medical use for them. And this included cannabis, cocaine, ketamine, LSD, methamphetamine, MDMA, and other ecstasy, and 6-MAM. 6-MAM is 6-monoacetyl morphine, which is the precursor for heroin. A year on, the Risk Solutions were commissioned to write a report for the Department of Transport, and they evaluated the new drug drive legislation for that year, just to see what had happened. The way this was working was that police would stop you if they suspect you of drug driving. They test your saliva using one of these devices. I think the most popular one is the Securitech down the bottom right there. So they take a saliva sample, and that would give you a yes/no answer as to whether you had cannabis or cocaine in your saliva, or probably more correctly, BZE, the metabolite cocaine in your saliva. And if that was the case, then they would take a blood sample and send it off to a lab to get the concentration measured. Who did they stop? Well, this is the age range of the people they stopped. Most of them were young, so in the 20 to 30 range, the majority of people, 50% of people, but right up to 60 pluses here. Interestingly, when they looked at the percentage of saliva tests giving a positive result, it was much the same across all the ages except the over 50. So about 50%, between 50 and 60% of them were positive for drugs. So well targeted by the police, I think. Always there's a worry about whether or not they're being fair. So this is the ethnicity, and you can see perhaps a little bit of an excess on black individuals, but that might be just the fact that a lot of this is to do with urban areas. There's not really any real difference in statistics between those numbers. What did they find? Well, cocaine and cannabis were the major positive findings when they did the blood concentrations. And one of the things we were worried about as a panel was how long it would actually take to have a blood sample taken. Because if you don't take the blood sample close enough to the preliminary test, you might find that the blood concentration has fallen too far. But it looked like most people were sampled between 30 minutes and 2 hours, which is perfectly good enough. Looking at concentrations, there were mostly, there was quite a few that were, sorry, start again. There were 28% of them were actually lower than the limit, but other people were higher, up to greater than 10, 6% were. I'm going to come back to concentrations. It's quite confusing because of the way we measure the concentrations and the laboratory, the things that we've been told to do by Department for Transport and the forensic regulator about measuring concentrations. This is cocaine. Cocaine, not benzoylene, the metabolite. This is cocaine itself. Actually, 60% were below the limit. BZE, this is the metabolite, the breakdown product of cocaine. That's much more demonstrative in terms of not of impairment, but of whether you've been taking cocaine or not, and it stays around for a lot longer. So looking at across the year, you can see the Section 4 offence in terms of number of proceedings brought was relatively constant across, but starting in April when the law was brought, when Section 5A offence was coming in, Section 5A prosecutions started to rise. So there was an impact, if only in the number of prosecutions. And this just shows the concentrations there were. And THC cannabis, in other words, and cocaine, again, were the majority of the findings that were where there were positives. The other drugs, the other 14 drugs, actually made up only about 3% of the positive samples. So hardly any other drugs were found. And the biggest one of those was ecstasy, MDMA, and that was only 1.3%. So we've got a law that looks at 17 drugs. Actually, we could probably do the law that only looks at 3 of them, and we get most people. So this group on the right, this is the other 14 drugs, very small numbers. So let's look at the Section 5A limits. And I've grouped this as as was suggested. At the top, we've got the therapeutic drugs, amphetamine, clonazepam, diazepam, etc., clonazepam. And then at the bottom, we've got the illicit drugs or the recreational drugs. And the limits for the recreational drugs are very much lower than the limits for the therapeutic drugs. You might wonder what this multiplier is on the right-hand side. I'm just going to explain that to you now. But this is these are the drugs that we concentrate on because that's what we find in most people. And in fact, BZE, benzylethylamine, and cocaine are actually, for the point of view of, of going to court, they're treated as one thing. So you don't get extra points on your license if you're found with BZE and cocaine. It's BZE and cocaine, or BZE alone, or cocaine alone, and you're guilty of the offence. So what are the multipliers? Well, we might call them deductions, but it's easier to multiply than deduct. So what we do is we apply a correction to the analytical results to allow for uncertainty. And we use 3 times the standard deviation of our assay method, a so-called expanded uncertainty of k equals 3. And when you subtract that number from your value, you've got a 99.7% confidence. So you can be 99.7% confident in the result. And the result then is reported as not less than. So for example, if in the lab, if we measure 4, we report it as not less than 2.8, which is 4 times 0.74, because the multiplier for THC is 0.7. All accredited laboratories use the same multiplier. So there's a level playing field across the UK. So let's have a look at the first 2,488 motorists that the samples of which came into our Laboratory Analytical Services International. We use one assay, single assay. We measure tetrahydrocannabinol, in other words, THC cannabis. We also measure the metabolite of cannabis. That's not in the legislation, but we measure it anyway because we can do that at the same time. And then we measure the other 16 specified drugs. We use a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry method with triple quad MS-MS detection. And then the whole assay and the laboratory have been accredited by UCAS to ISO 17025. So we are an accredited laboratory. So 2,488 whole blood samples. Nominally, they should be 5 mils. The healthcare professional is supposed to take a 10 mil sample from the motorist and then split that into 2. So it's a single sample split into 2. Those go into into vials, which go into tamper-evident bags. The motorist gets to choose which sample he'll have if he wants to take one off and get analyzed himself. The samples are all fluoride oxalate preserved with anticoagulant. So they don't clot. And one of the things we check when we look at a sample, is it, if it's clotted, you'll get the wrong results. We checked for clots in our samples before we analyze them. Most of our samples come from the police, but we're one of the few labs, and perhaps the only accredited lab, that will take samples from private individuals and do defense samples. So we're taking both police and private individual samples. So this is what we find. Not guilty. None of the 17 drugs were found in 22% of the motorists. Tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabis by itself, was 57% of the motorists. Cocaine, or BZE, 19%. And then the occasional cannabis, cocaine, and BZE was 6%. And just like the first year of this, we found the same thing. Only about 3% of the other drugs were actually included. And you can see here, in fact, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Only 7, in other words, 7 out of 14 drugs there. So we didn't have any other positives for the other drugs. So same thing. Let's just look at the limits a bit and see how that looks. We proposed as a panel an 80 microgram per liter limit for cocaine. If we used that, we would have got no drivers positive. The enacted limit was 10 micrograms per limit. That's caught 70% of drivers who were positive for cocaine. They had limits above 10. Now, one of the problems we have, as I said, is about the limits we've got on our calibration. The way we were asked to do this, we've calibrated for cocaine between 4 and 100 micrograms per limit. That means our maximum value can only be 65 because of the deduction or the multiplier, whatever you want to call it. So we are automatically lower than the limit that was proposed by the panel. The reason 80 micrograms per litre was proposed by the panel is because that is the concentration which we deem to be equivalent to 80 milligrams per decilitre of alcohol, the same level of impairment. It's even worse for BZE. We proposed a limit of 500 micrograms per litre. None of the drivers we measured actually had 500 micrograms per litre, which is not surprising because our top calibrator is 500 micrograms per limit. But then when you multiply that by when you use the multiplier, our top standard is actually 400. So we would never see any drivers the way we're assaying it. The enacted limit was 50 micrograms per litre, and that all the people who are positive for BZE, I've got 88% of the drivers who were positive for BZE. THC Cannabis, we proposed a limit of 5 micrograms per litre. Some said that was quite low. I've seen recently some data from Europe where they were suggesting somewhere between 7 and 10 would be a better limit, and that would correspond to 80 milligrams per deciliter of alcohol in terms of impairment. At 5 micrograms per litre, we would have got 40% of the drivers who proved positive. At 2 micrograms per litre, the enacted level, we got 80% of the drivers who were positive for THC. So certainly we've got a limit that's much lower than it needs to be if we're talking about impairment, and it's taking up what was suggested by Sir Peter North in his suggestion that we introduce a limit that was actually lower than it needed to be, and that's what we've got here with the levels that we've got. So we've introduced his recommendation 15 to consider a zero tolerance offence. So for those drugs that are recreational, we've got a zero tolerance approach. And that in itself has caused a little bit of a problem when it comes to what the courts do with these concentrations. So you get stopped, you get convicted, or not convicted, you get stopped, you get a Section 5A offence, you're over the limit for Section 5A, and the courts were beginning to interpret those as impairment levels. And the forensic science regulator had to step in and give guidance to point out that drugs without medicinal use, in other words, the recreational drugs, it was a zero tolerance approach and not an impairment level. So you couldn't use them as evidence of impairment. You could only use them as evidence that someone had taken a drug. But that aside, what about the impact on legislation? Well, these are the data that I've got, the most recent data I've got. We run along with a Section 5 offence, that's alcohol, at about 40,000 court cases a year on people driving over the limit for alcohol. If you look at Section 4, it's about 1,000, but actually that's been dropping steadily since 2014 when the Section 5A offence was coming. So it was 1,050 in 2014, 2018 it had dropped down to 726. So Section 4 is falling, which is exactly why Section 5A was introduced, to stop the police having to demonstrate impairment, but to use just the blood concentration data with the objective measure. And of course, Section 5A has been increasing. So in 2018, we had 13,000 court cases with Section 5A offences. I listened to this program last week or the week before. It's about, is legal cannabis business about to go global? And the conclusion of the program was it probably is. and you'll see why in a minute why that's an issue. So this is where cannabis is legal at the minute. This is from Wikipedia. The blue countries have legalized cannabis. The red are where it's still illegal, and the yellow is where it's decriminalized. It's interesting to see that Britain is still supposedly, it's still probably illegal, or still supposedly legal, sorry, start again. It's still supposedly illegal in Britain, but I would say that actually we seem to have decriminalized it. Anyone who lives around where I live, which is Camberwell, and walks down Cold Harbour Lane to Brixton, you will get the whiff of cannabis on the air, and people are in the street openly smoking it and not being arrested. So I think even though we haven't legalized cannabis, we are turning a blind eye to it. And of course we have, the green now is showing where it's legal to have medicinal cannabis. And you can see that even in the UK, we have legal cannabis for medicinal use. So is that going to change things? Well, I think it's going to be, it's not if cannabis will be legalized, but when. And when that happens, I think we need to rethink our limits, or else we're going to end up convicting a vast number of people with concentrations of cannabis over 2 micrograms per litre, which may not be affecting their driving. So we need to maybe look at this again if cannabis does become legal. So in summary, 13,000 drivers convicted in 2018 of a Section 5A offence. Cannabis and cocaine make up the bulk of the positive findings from drug driving samples. Of concern is perhaps that 22% of samples which contained none of the 17 drugs. And we've got ethics committee approval to do some research to screen the negative samples to look for other potentially impairing drugs. And then the question will be, should other drugs be added to the Section 5A offence for the Road Traffic Act? And that's something we'll have to think about. And then will legalisation of cannabis cause a rethink in THC limits? Because the courts will be overwhelmed, perhaps. So the unanswered questions as far as Section A are concerned is, has it actually reduced the incidence of road traffic collisions? Given that we've got a zero tolerance approach, has it reduced illicit drug consumption? We don't know. More importantly, has it saved lives? And really, I have no idea whether it has or not. I'm not quite sure how we even go around to how we get around to showing that it's saved lives. So thank you very much for listening. I'd just like to thank a few people who've contributed to this. My staff at ASI, Miwa Shaw, Daniel Desalisa, Hassan Karambukas, Gemma Coombs, Lewis, and of course Kim Wolf for her chairing of the drug driving panel. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Atholl. I'm sorry about the echo in here, but I've got into the building.
Let you in,
nothing else in it. Let's just say I worked out a way to gain access. So Leslie's been keeping an eye on the questions for us. So Leslie, what have we got?
Okay, we've got a few questions. Thank you, Atholl. The first one is, how do our figures in the UK compare with other countries? And do you think the difference, higher or lower than some countries, is linked to what is considered acceptable levels according to the legislation? And that's from Jill Batley.
I went to the SOFT meeting last year in America. SOFT is the Society of Forensic Toxicology. It's the American Association for Toxicologists. And it's quite interesting that they've got a very different range. The cannabis values that they measure out there are massively higher than what we've got. Partly that may be the way, as I say, we're limited in the way we measure it. And if you take, there's one laboratory, actually the biggest laboratory, only has a top concentration of 10 micrograms per litre. and everything above that they just say is greater than that. And whereas in America the limits go sky high. I was amazed to see 25, 26 as quite regular values over there. Interestingly, a policeman rang me up and said, you know, you've reported 24 in this, it's really high. I've never seen anything above 7. And he hadn't appreciated that the assay limited the top value you could get to. So I had to explain that to him, that when you have a top value of 10, which is standard one of the laboratories has, you're never going to get anything more than 7 because of the multiplier. The other thing about the American and actually the Canadian, I was going to review this and then I sort of ran out of time. When I looked at the figures, they get a massive amount of methamphetamine. Methamphetamine in Canada, in Quebec, is the #1 drug. It's not cannabis, it's methamphetamine. And the soft meeting showed something similar. Methamphetamine's a big issue over there. So I think our figures are actually quite low for drug driving, and the concentrations we get are quite low as well.
Thank you. We have another question from Robin Ferner saying, when prosecution and defence samples are analysed, how often are they different?
Well, Robin, I don't know the answer to that. One of the problems tends to be occasionally that we get samples for defence samples, and they are much lower than, they take much longer to reach us. So we'll do the police samples as they come in the door, and sometimes the defence will sit on their samples for some time. And if they're lower, it might be because they've kept them in the fridge for too long, assuming they've kept them in the fridge. Actually, we had a case this week done in Wales, and my colleague Hassan went down as defence sample, and they were much lower than the prosecution sample, but the defendant actually got off. They shouldn't be any different. We do, as I said, we treat a private motorist sample in exactly the same way as the police. It's no different to us. The analyst doesn't know whether it's a private sample or not. It's just a blood sample. It looks exactly the same because it comes in a tamper-evident bag, and inside that there's a security container, and inside the security container is the blood sample. And the analyst has no way of knowing whether we've given them a defense sample or whether we've given them a prosecution sample. So there should be no difference, provided the laboratories are in agreement with one another.
Okay, I've got something from the chat, and then we've got some more questions coming into the Q&A as well. This is from Sam Haycox saying, is the blood data for Section 5A not biased towards THC and cocaine, as these are the only drugs that are screened for at the roadside?
Yes, I think that's a reasonable thing. You know, it's not cheap to have this analysis done, and the other problem for the police is the laboratories don't have the capacity to do all the samples that they want done, and you'd have to ask the police as to whether that's limiting what they submit. But they have the option of Section 4 if they think it's another drug of doing that. But as you say, it is biased because they only test for cannabis and cocaine at the roadside.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Richard Brown, just saying that the different laboratories in the UK have different upper limits of quantification. Do you think THC, for example, should simply be reported as OPL regardless of level over the limit to aid consistency between labs?
That's a very interesting question, because it's an argument I've had with my colleagues last week at exactly that. I think you know, we're spending a lot of time and effort making sure we've got accurate results at all levels across our calibration range. We're making sure our duplicates agree very closely. And yes, I think we could just get away with, given that it's the concentration means nothing. The court should not be taking any notice of if we say it's if, for example, we say it's 24 or someone else says it's 10, it shouldn't make any difference at all, because it's not like alcohol. The higher your alcohol, the higher your sentence. And that's not the same for drugs. So yes, I believe we could get away with just a yes/no answer, over or under the limit. And that might actually make things a lot simpler in terms of challenges in court as well. Because at the moment, because we do defense work, I get these data packs, which I've got to go through and see whether the other laboratory has done an accurate job or not. And it's difficult. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'm for it.
Kim is saying that I think the drug driving legislation has improved the ability to attribute RTC to drug driving and prosecute drivers. In 2014-17, prosecution for careless, dangerous driving under influence of drugs, and in 2019 the number had risen to 80. That's Ministry of Justice statistics there. So offence has contributed to taking more dangerous drug drivers off the roads, at least. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's true. Certainly more people have been taken off the road. Whether that's made anything safer or not, I don't know. As I say, it's still an unanswered question as to whether or not it's reduced road traffic accidents, or road traffic collisions or deaths. You know, it stands to reason that it should have done, but it's not difficult. It's difficult to show it.
So Gajendra Reddy, who says that working in Scotland and doing high numbers of Section 5A bloods due to COVID, there's a long delay in getting the results, as told by the police, and in some cases up to a year. Will that affect the result or the prosecution?
Well, it can only be, I think, in the motorist's favour, because the concentration is likely to fall over that time. So yes, I think you have to ask yourself whether it's worth doing it after a year. You know, justice should be swift. I think we've got a limit of 6 months. I think you have to be charged in England and Wales before you're out of time. So the police have a problem in getting enough capacity for these to be done.
We most certainly do. Atholl, sorry to cut you off there, Leslie. It's just that we've got so many questions coming in, Atholl, but sadly we're pretty much out of time. So I would just like to thank you once more. I'm certainly going to be picking up that last point with you and your colleagues, because it is a problem for policing, as you've identified, something of a national crisis at the moment. So it's a really timely talk for us. Thank you very much for giving your time. Thank you all of you for tuning in to listen. If you've got other questions that are pertinent and you haven't had a chance to ask them, then do feel free to write into BAFS, because we'll always try to get answers from our experts and from our speakers for you if we possibly can. If you're not a member of BAFS already, please do consider joining. We've got another talk coming up on the 25th of May on miscarriage of justice. We've had some really good feedback from these online seminars, so I hope you'll join us for another. But I would just like to finish with saying thank you very, very much indeed, Atholl. It's been a real pleasure. Much appreciated. Hope you all have a really good evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much for listening.